At Manhattan University, a graduate degree is not out of reach. You'll gain real-world skills, credentials employers value, and connections to New York City's top companies. Choose from their new Master of Science degrees in healthcare informatics, digital marketing and analytics, business analytics, or financial analytics, all built around hands-on learning and industry partnerships. Graduate ready to lead, not just work. Take the next step at manhattan.edu/graduate. Manhattan University. Lead the future.
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
People love him and respect him. Roger Stone.
Now, get in the zone. It's the Stone Zone. Here's Roger Stone.
You are diving headfirst into the deep end of the Stone Zone. Late last week, the New York Times breathlessly reported that Lindsay Halligan is under investigation by the Florida bar. They had very red faces the next day when they were forced essentially to report that the Florida bar denies that there's any ongoing investigation of Lindsay Halligan. But perhaps I need to remind you who Lindsay Halligan is and why this is significant. You see, Eric Siebert was the U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, and he was charged with investigating and potentially prosecuting the case of FBI Director James Comey. You see, Comey said under oath before the U.S. Senate, when asked if he had ever transmitted classified information to any third party and directed that third party to give it to the media, he specifically said no. Yet an investigation produced both emails and an admission that Comey had passed classified information designed to put Donald Trump in a poor light to Daniel Richman, a longtime friend and advisor of the president. And therefore, Comey was quite vulnerable to the same charges they brought against me, the violation of the False Statements Act. However, the U.S. Attorney, Siebert, who was charged with investigating crime, never disclosed that he had a glaring conflict of interest, that his father-in-law, his wife's father, was not only the godfather to James Comey's daughter, but had also represented Comey briefly as his personal attorney. That would normally eliminate a prosecutor. They would recuse themselves from such a case. Rather than do so, Eric Siebert was preparing a 50-page brief on why deep stater James Comey should not be charged in that crime. So he was fired by President Donald Trump. He claimed that he resigned, but if so, he resigned hours ahead of being terminated. And the president appointed Halligan, a White House lawyer. Now, the media immediately began to denigrate Halligan as an insurance lawyer, trying to imply that she was some kind of ambulance chaser, unqualified for this position. She is indeed a former beauty queen. She's a statuesque beauty. They seem to hold that against her as well. But she also was a senior partner in a Virginia law firm in charge of their civil litigation practice with a specialty in mortgage law and real estate law, which became very handy in her subsequent investigation into New York Attorney General Letitia James. In order to proceed on that case, it's a pretty straightforward case. And once again, Halligan took evidence to a grand jury that voted to indict Comey. And she took evidence in the Letitia James case, where essentially James had signed documents under oath claiming that she would live in, as a full-time residence, a Virginia home she purchased, thus getting a lower mortgage rate and a lower tax rate and a tax break. But of course, if she lived in Virginia, she would be constitutionally unqualified to be the Attorney General of New York. In fact, James had a 43 record of serial mortgage fraud, had lied about both residential properties that she owned, had failed to report a number of significant mortgages on her New York State required disclosure forms. So in the end, the only way that they could get those two cases dismissed in the deep state was to get a judge to rule that Halligan's appointment was somehow improper under the Federal Vacancies Act, a judicial decision that, quite frankly, is just wrong. It's on appeal, and it will be overturned on appeal. But in the meantime, I think it is important to kind of look at the actions of the three judges in this case, because I've never quite seen anything like it. Judge Michael Nachmanoff was the main judge. For some reason, they brought in a judge from an entirely different jurisdiction, from South Carolina, a Judge McGowan Curry, and last but not worst, Judge William Fitzpatrick, to say that these three federal judges engaged in an attack on this indictment that was based with conjecture, prohibited media narratives, personalized attacks on the U.S. attorney, and procedural anomalies that have no precedent anywhere in federal criminal practice. In other words, these judges violated the judicial canon of ethics, which require neutrality, certain other ethical obligations, and they had a constitutional rule to be fair in the case of the grand jury. Judges cannot say from the bench that they read something in the newspaper or saw it on TV. They are supposed to, by law, to learn everything about the facts from the briefings and the written briefings and what happens in the law room. But Judge Nachmanoff continually referred to things that he had read in the media. According to Canon 3, judges cannot lie on external reporting. Canon 3 specifically prohibits it. In another case, you could see how one-sided the proceeding was. The judge interrupted Lindsay Halligan repeatedly whenever she tried to speak. The judge never once interrupted the defense. He continued to silence the Attorney General, kept misstating her records, he kept prejudging her prosecutorial independence from the bench. These are personal attacks from the bench, all prohibited under the standard court rules. Then there was Judge Cameron McGowan Curry. For some reason, she was brought in from South Carolina. She also engaged in personal attacks on Halligan. An overwhelming media presence describes her as a White House aide who has no prosecutorial experience. That's not legal reasoning. It was character assassination. It would have nothing to do about the evidence that was presented to the grand jury. She also pointed repeatedly to abundant newspaper reporting. But the worst of them all was a Judge William G. Fitzpatrick. He engaged in distortion, conjecture, false misleading minutes, and other ethical breaches. He actually claimed that the indictment was invalid because there had not been a quorum of grand jurors present, and that there was a missing gap in the audio version of the grand jury proceedings. When Halligan tried to respond, the judge told her to sit down and shut up. That afternoon, the court was required to file a public apology for their being incorrect. The judge also took a quote, cut it in half to give it two different meanings. The part that he barred from the record was, of course, dispositive. This is a violation of Canon 2A, which requires integrity and avoidance of speculation. The judges rested entirely on conjecture rather than evidence. Also, a violation of Canon 3A. Findings must be based on the court record. So, I guess my message to the New York Times and Josh Bromwich, who breathlessly reported this case, that Lindsay Halligan was under investigation by the Florida Bar, which is a lowly smear because she's done nothing wrong other than serve her country. That attack was, of course, a setup. This was being pushed by one of the many nonprofits funded with dark money by George Soros. Very, very specifically, in this case, an operative pushed this narrative. Her name, let's grab this real quickly. Very interesting operation. This is lawfare. This is where they file these attacks against you that are baseless, knowing that it takes you time and money to fight them. And that's what I believe it is. Citizens for Accountability was the first operation that made this claim. The Michelle Cupper-Smith, who is not an attorney but is the chief hit woman for CFA, the Campaign for Accountability, and other front organizations, have engaged here in lawfare. In other words, file bar complaints as a nuisance, which is what this is. However, I saw today that any citizen can file a grievance against a judge. I think anyone who looks at these three Virginia judges ought to consider such a formal complaint because the smearing of Lindsay Halligan is outrageous, completely and totally outrageous, and to seek to have her disbarred on the basis of false claims is outrageous. There is no pending bar examination, said a spokeswoman for the Florida bar situation. The situation is extraordinary. Meanwhile, the investigation into whether our 2020 elections were on the up and up continues. The FBI now expanding a major criminal investigation into possible election irregularities, issuing grand jury subpoenas to obtain a massive trove of voting records from Arizona's largest county. This comes, of course, on the heels of the raid on the Fulton County Election Board warehouse where records were seized. Seems like the president and the attorney general and the director of national intelligence are very serious about taking a hard look at not only mail-in ballots but electronic voting machines and whether it is, as I believe, possible for them to manipulate election results, perhaps even from offshore. I'm certain that the capability exists. I don't have absolute proof that it happened in 2020, but that, of course, is the role of the government to learn these things. Federal investigators in Georgia say they're now reviewing gigabytes of election data from Maricopa County, the state's most populous jurisdiction, home to Phoenix. The subpoenas came late last week after the FBI conducted a high-profile raid near Atlanta, seizing ballots connected to the 2020 election in Fulton County, Georgia. The investigation appears to be widening as federal agents examine potential violations of election laws across multiple states. I believe the president was robbed in 2020. The idea of Joe Biden got 81 million votes when he was essentially a diaper-wearing vegetable for most of the campaign, relegated to his basement, and it only went downhill from there. One of the most alarming findings in Arizona suggests that more than 200,000 ballots with mismatched signatures may have been counted without proper verification, which far exceeds the roughly 25,000 mismatches that were previously acknowledged by the Maricopa County figures. This has all got to come to a head before 2026. And the SAVE Act, of course, would solve all these problems. Instead of getting bogged down in all of the intricacies of mail-in ballots and the manipulative machines, let's start by making a law that says you have to be a U.S. citizen before you can vote, and you have to have a valid photo ID. It's pretty simple to me. They call it the SAVE Act. President Trump calls it the Save America Act. There are 50 votes for it right now in the U.S. Senate, but because John Thune is a coward and because of some antiquated custom the Democrats will get rid of the instant they have control, called the filibuster, America may not be saved. It is an outrage. We'll talk about it on the other side. Listening to the Stone Zone. I'll be right back.
Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
He likes politics and he's a professional at the highest level. Roger Stone. Where's Roger?
At Manhattan University, a graduate degree is not out of reach. You'll gain real-world skills, credentials employers value, and connections to New York City's top companies. Choose from their new Master of Science degrees in healthcare informatics, digital marketing and analytics, business analytics, or financial analytics, all built around hands-on learning and industry partnerships. Graduate ready to lead, not just work. Take the next step at manhattan.edu/graduate. Manhattan University. Lead the future.
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
Roger Stone, who's a one of the smartest political minds. Roger Stone was persecuted. People forget he's actually a brilliant political analyst.
Now, get in the zone. It's the Stone Zone. Here's Roger Stone.
And we're back. Well, like any political junkie, and I certainly am one, I watched the Texas primaries last week with great interest. I must say I'm going to miss the comic relief of Jasmine Crockett. She had quite an act, but she didn't make it in the Democrat Senate primary. Instead, they have nominated a guy who I call Beto O'Rourke Light. They're going to try to pass this very young state legislator, James Talrico, off as a moderate, but there's nothing moderate about him. More amazingly, of course, no Republican candidate reached the 50% mark in the U.S. Senate primary. Current incumbent U.S. Senate John Cornyn facing very popular Trump-aligned Attorney General Ken Paxton and Wesley Hunt, an excellent, upstanding conservative member of Congress, took about 13% of the vote, which means neither of the two front runners made the nomination. So there is a runoff. And incredibly, Ken Paxton has announced that if the U.S. Senate will kill the filibuster and allow the vice president to break the tie and pass the SAVE Act, he will drop out of the race and not force the runoff. This is the first time in 50 years I have seen a politician put his personal ambition aside in the best interests of the country. I don't think anyone's going to take him up on it, but I think it was a sincere offer and one of the most interesting things I've seen in a 50-year career in American politics. The SAVE Act is crucial for Republicans to win again in 26 and in 28, and without it, I think we are in deep trouble. This, and I've endorsed no candidate in this race, but Ken Paxton is a loyal friend. And at this juncture, his offering to step aside, I think, is actually going to boost him if the runoff goes forward. You're listening to the Stone Zone. I'm Roger Stone. We'll be right back with more.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
This is the Stone Zone Now, get him his own. It's the Stone Zone.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone. Where's Roger Stone?
Here's Roger Stone.
President Donald Trump gathered a coalition of Western Hemisphere allies in Florida at his palatial Doral Country Club to launch an aggressive new partnership aimed at dismantling both the violent drug cartels that have fueled crime, migration, and instability across the Americas. Speaking at the Shield of America's summit, the president announced the formation of America's Counter-Cartel Coalition, which is a new military partnership designed to confront cartels using coordinated security and military resources. Just in recent months, President Trump has ended the drug trafficking from Venezuela into the United States. He's also ended the drug trafficking, lesser known but very substantial, from Honduras into the United States. And of course, Cuba is not largely an importer of drugs because their underwhelming lack of cash. They barely have enough boat fuel to get from Havana to our shores. President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have really made opposition to Marxist narco-terrorism in this hemisphere a centerpiece of their foreign policy. The president said, on this historic day, we come together to announce a brand new military coalition to eradicate the criminal cartels plaguing our region. Present were the heads of state from more than a dozen stations, including my good friend Javier Milei from Argentina, the president of Ecuador, the new president Tito Asfura of Honduras, President Bukele of El Salvador, the president of Panama, the extremely impressive president of Paraguay, and as well as the president of the Dominican Republic. They were all there. The Dominican government, of course, in the past has been very, very pro-Biden. It is considered a left-of-center government. I was surprised, but I guess happy to see them there. But he brought together largely conservative or right-of-center governments within this hemisphere. Trump has said the initiative will strengthen military cooperation and so on, but all of the talk in the last 2 weeks has been about Cuba. This is a subject I feel deeply about because my wife is a Cuban American. Her father was a Cuban diplomat. In fact, he was the military attaché at the Cuban consulate in Washington, D.C. at the time of Batista. And when Batista fell and Castro took power, he was ordered to return to Havana for briefings. Fortunately, the night before he was to leave, a friendly CIA man knocked on the door to warn my father-in-law not to return to Cuba because he was on a list of people who would have been liquidated. He had poor command of English because he didn't need it for his job in the Cuban embassy. He worked as a fuller brushman, a house painter, a printer, having lost everything he owned back in Havana, his home, his bank account, his savings, his insurance, left it all. So this only strengthened my anti-communism, and I recognize how incredibly brutal the regime has been. People don't really realize that it is the American press and the deep state of its time that empowered Fidel Castro. We did everything humanly possible to undercut Batista. Now, Batista was no day at the beach when it came to human rights, and he was epically corrupt. But our ambassador, Earl E.T. Smith, later the mayor of Palm Beach, a close friend of Richard Nixon's, tried to tell the State Department that the rebels in the hills would ultimately win control and become a thorn in our side. Turns out to be absolutely right. His book, The Fourth Floor, very much worth reading if you want to understand. But the media told us that Fidel Castro was a dashing, romantic, Robin Hood-like figure who was simply going to rob from the rich and give to the poor. He got the full treatment, particularly from the New York Times. And he had a very kind of reformer image. Plus, he understood the optics, so of course he had his fatigues and his cigars and his trademark beard. And of course, famously, while staying at the Waldorf Hotel, he and his men plucked chickens in the living room of the palatial suite to prepare dinner. He was very much a showman. Very briefly after Castro took power in Havana, he asked for a meeting with President Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower understood that his direct meeting with Fidel Castro would imply recognition of Castro's government. Therefore, he sent Vice President Richard Nixon and the president's office in the Capitol for almost 5 hours, 4.5 hours. Eisenhower had asked his vice president to kind of size Castro up. And Nixon came back from that meeting correctly telling Eisenhower that Castro was not some kind of exotic reformer, but he was a hardcore Marxist and that he would be a problem. Nixon, of course, turned out to be prophetic about that. It's interesting, my good friend Ed Cox, who is often I'm on the radio with and who's is President Nixon's son-in-law, would later visit Cuba, would get a visit with Castro, who asked him point blank, how did your father know I was a communist? It's a great and true story. Of course, Nixon's entire persona in the country was based on his nailing Alger Hiss as a spy. This is why the left hated him. It's why they ultimately brought him down, a part of why they brought him down. But he was correct about Alger Hiss, who was a Yale and Harvard educated bureaucrat close to both FDR and President Truman. And Nixon claimed in House hearings that Hiss was a spy. Hiss would ultimately be convicted of perjury. Many, many years later, when the Iron Curtain fell and all the KGB records became available to us, we learned that, well, Alger Hiss really was a spy. That part of the story doesn't get written. Big news in this last week, and I cite a number of other journalists, but James Rosen broke a major story, something that many of us in the research community have known for some time, but that during the Nixon presidency, he was being actively spied on by the deep state. Very specifically, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were spying on Nixon's national security operation. They were photocopying and stealing documents out of briefcases, out of files, out of desks. They were dealing with classified information. They rifled Henry Kissinger's briefcase, General Al Haig's briefcase. Why? Because they were opposed to an end of the war in Vietnam, which Nixon was driving to. They were opposed to a strategic arms limitation agreement with the Soviets, which Nixon was driving it for. And they were particularly opposed to the opening to China. Now, I have to keep having this argument, but at the time that Nixon made the decision to play China and Russia off against each other in the foreign policy realm, China was a dirt-poor, backwards, agrarian society in which very few people had indoor plumbing or electricity. There was really no way for Nixon to know that 30 years later, Bill Clinton would give China most favored nation trading status, which is what made them the superpower that they are today. So this story was actually, I give them credit, published in the New York Times, which I was most interested to see. Anyway, with President Trump now is going to clearly focus on this Western Hemisphere, we've now informally renamed the Monroe Doctrine, the Don-roe Doctrine. This move comes as Cuba has dramatically expanded its economic footprint throughout Latin America, while cartel violence continues to destabilize the region. This I can tell you. The Chinese are everywhere. They seek to infiltrate all strata of any society, whether it is academia, business, the military, the government, and they are quick with capital when American businessmen are less likely to step forward. So they try to force their way into the Caribbean nations, financing hotels or hospitals or airports or so on. They don't really care in the end whether they make money. They just want to get in. And there is no question, of course, that they have been funding the cartels. They are the makers of the fentanyl, that is being brought over our borders. I think the president made it very clear by taking out Nicolas Maduro that he was done with this, and he is making America great again. The ramifications of trade and border security and now drug interdiction will have huge results for the country. So I think it is an extraordinarily important initiative, and I was glad to see all of those Latin American leaders. You see it in the succession of elections. In Chile, they have just elected a conservative government, for example. So I think freedom is on the march in this particular hemisphere, and the president is surprising me in that his foreign policy, whether it is in Central America or whether it is in the Middle East or whether it is between Ukraine and Russia, he uses a combination of military strength, and he does that in a very measured and focused but very lethal way. Economic pressure. He's winning the oil game, folks. He's cut off a third of China's access to cheap oil. He's cut off virtually all of the oil for Cuba. So this is going to have incredible ramifications. The Chinese now, with this lack of oil, would have to think long and hard about any attempt to seize Taiwan, for example. So Trump playing the long game, but I think using effectively all three. And of course, we're all interested to see what will happen with Cuba. Reports that Marco Rubio has been in talks and may have agreements with Raul Castro's grandson, who is a high-level party figure. Now, whether they will just surrender, as the president has suggested, I pray to God that he's right. But this is a brutal regime with excellent intelligence in this country. But I would love to see them to be the next domino to fall in the trend of freedom. And it is only due to the extraordinary efforts of Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, who I'm proud to say I supported every time he ran for the Senate, including when he challenged Governor Charlie Crist. His politics were not always mine. He used to be a bit more of a neocon than I am, but he has done an excellent job of executing President Trump's foreign policy, which isn't boots on the ground, multi-casualty, multi-billion-dollar endless war, but a more limited, focused, lethal use of American power. He's not an isolationist, but he is still an interventionist. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to Stone Zone, and we'll be right back.
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
He likes politics, and he's a professional at the highest level. Roger Stone. Where's Roger?
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated weed whacker guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
Roger Stone, who's a very, one of the smartest political minds. Roger Stone was persecuted. People forget he's actually a brilliant political analyst.
Now, get in the zone. It's the Stone Zone. Here's Roger Stone.
Well, New York City's far-left mayor, Zoran Mamdani, is facing outrage from the city's Jewish residents after reports surfaced that his wife liked social media posts celebrating the October 7th terrorist attacks against Israel. The posts, highlighted by the Jewish Insider, were shared by left-wing activist accounts and included imagery from the Hamas assault that killed roughly 1,200 Israelis. One post featured terrorists riding in a stolen Israeli military vehicle with the caption, "Resisting apartheid since 1948." Another showed a bulldozer breaching the Gaza border barrier on the day of the attack with the words, "Breaking the walls of apartheid and military occupation." October 7th, 2023. Records on social media indicated that Rama Duwaji, the First Lady of New York City, I apologize if I mispronounced that, had liked the posts. When asked about the reports, the radical mayor dismissed the criticism, insisting his wife should not face public scrutiny. Mandami said, "My wife is the love of my life. She's also a private person who has held no formal position on my campaign or my city hall." In other words, he threw her under the bus. He argues that his wife is not a public figure, but there's no indication that he doesn't share her views. But she has made herself into a public figure in recent months, reveling in the spotlight. So you can't have it both ways. She appeared in multiple media features, given interviews, was featured on the cover of New York Magazine, the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print embellished with a left-wing tint. Also published profiles highlighting her artwork and her fashion. So I don't see her views as being off-limit. In fact, I think the woman is an anti-Semite. She, at a minimum, has anti-Semite leanings. And she should be lionized without as a second thought, to me, is an absurdity. I find these views repugnant, and I think many New Yorkers would. I'm not sure, had this been known before the election, however, that it would have made much of a difference. It is about the demographic changes in New York City, and the fact that this Marxist progressive group within the Democratic Party has gained strength over time. There has been a mass exodus of white voters and others from New York City, which has become increasingly Hispanic, increasingly African American, and increasingly Muslim. And less than a third today of city residents are Catholics. That was certainly not true when Robert Wagner was elected mayor. So the Democrat Party has plunged headlong into insanity. Old-time corporate Democrats like Chuck Schumer, who looks very, very scared to me. I mean, if AOC should step forward, I think Chuck is done. Remember, she beat Joe Crowley, who was the head of the Queens Democrat machine, to win that seat in the past. She's not much of a cox. Remember, I hear she makes one hell of a martini. If she drops back and doesn't run for president, runs for the U.S. Senate in New York's Democrat primary, I think she would be heavily favored to win. Chuck can raise big corporate money. He's like a vacuum cleaner in that sense, but she could raise literally millions of dollars of small dollar donations. She would be a weaker general election candidate, but I think she would be favored. Maybe Chuck would throw in the towel and just ride off into the sunset, but they never go back to Pocatello, as one senator once said. And it looks to me like he's already hung on too long. Sometimes he seems uncomfortable. I've seen the video of him saying, "We must seal our borders. It's essentially we seal our borders," only to see him attacking President Trump on video weeks ago, for sealing our borders. I don't know how you live with that kind of hypocrisy. Anyway, that's my political take for the day. Thanks for joining us in the Stone Zone. I'm Roger Stone. Until tomorrow, God bless you and Godspeed.
The Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
He likes politics and he's a professional at the highest level. Roger Stone. Where's Roger?
At Manhattan University, a graduate degree is not out of reach. You'll gain real-world skills, credentials employers value, and connections to New York City's top companies. Choose from their new Master of Science degrees in healthcare informatics, digital marketing and analytics, business analytics, or financial analytics, all built around hands-on learning and industry partnerships. Graduate ready to lead, not just work. Take the next step at manhattan.edu/graduate. Manhattan University. Lead the future.